My second grade teacher wore black. She wore black shoes with buckles and black stockings or black hose. She wore a black dress with a black belt. She had black rimmed cat's eye glasses that hung around her neck on a chain. She had iron gray hair that she kept in a bun on the back of her head. And instead of a broomstick, she carried an 18-inch wooden ruler. And she would stalk the classroom looking for people who weren't doing what they were supposed to do. And one of those terrible infractions might be daydreaming. And I was a compulsive daydreamer. I couldn't help it. There was no getting around it. Daydreaming was me. And she would catch me, and she'd come after me with that ruler, and she'd make me stick up my left hand, and she would smack it, pow! And it hurt. Oh, it hurt so bad. And sometimes she'd smack it 2 or 3 or 4 times in one day because I couldn't stop daydreaming. And all the kids would turn around and stare at me and giggle, and it was so embarrassing, and it was awful. One time she smacked my palm 3 times. And I went home and I showed it to my dad and said, "Daddy, look at this." And he looked up from the Scientific American and said, "Well, you probably had that coming." Well, second grade was looking kind of grim for me. I didn't think I was going to make it. At the very least, I was going to lose a hand. And then one day, the teacher said, "Well, we're going to make volcanoes." And I could get into that. All of us were issued plastic trays and Underwood deviled ham cans. And there was this huge tub of paper mache. And we'd glop the paper mache together, and we'd make a sort of a volcano-shaped pile and stick the deviled ham can in the very top. And the teacher said that when the time come, we would put some soda in that little can and add some vinegar, and it would erupt. That sounded pretty cool to me. Well, I got busy painting my volcano, and she put some examples on the wall for us to look at. And I painted the best volcano. I put some serious art into that volcano. I put a red rim around the Underwood can, and I painted lava flows and red streaks and orange stripes, and I made that volcano magnificent. And I was telling my dad about this one night, and he says, "Huh." And the next night he comes home and he says, "Let's try something. Let's go out on the front porch." And he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out a test tube of orange crystals. And he puts a little pile of orange crystals on the sidewalk, a little pile about the size of a quarter. And he pulls out his Zippo lighter, the one he used to light his pipe, and he starts trying to light that little pile of crystals, and he can't get them lit with the Zippo. So he reaches in his pocket and he pulls out a little box of wooden matches that he used to light his cigars, and he couldn't get the little pile of orange crystals to light. They just wouldn't. And he said, "I've got an idea. Wait here." And he went in the house and he came back with a package of Black Cat firecrackers. Now, at our house, we had 3 kinds of firecrackers: Black Cat, zebras, and ladyfingers. And the ladyfingers went pop, and the zebras went pop, and the Black Cats were serious. And so he unbraided one of the fuses, one of the firecrackers. They came in a braid, and he unbraided one of the firecrackers, pulled the fuse out, stuck the fuse down in a little pile of orange crystals, lit that with his Zippo, And when the fuse got down to the orange crystals, they ignited. And they sizzled and cracked, and they threw white sparks and orange sparks up, and they produced a tremendous amount. I mean, a pile the size of a grapefruit of blackish, greenish ash. And then he looks at me, and he hands me the test tube. And then he hands me the little box of matches, and he gives me a fuse out of a black cat firecracker. And it says, now when your turn comes, don't put soda in that little can. Don't pour vinegar in there. Pour this orange crystals in there, and then, and for your information, by the way, these are ammonium dichromate crystals. And he says, and then stick the fuse in there and light it, stand back. Well, all of my classmates, you know, we'd go up one at a, there was a special table at the front of the room, and one by one my classmates would go up and they'd set up their tray, and they'd pour in their little thimble full of soda, and they'd pour in their little jigger full of vinegar, and the eruption would be less dramatic than overfilling a glass of Coca-Cola. I mean, it was just a... So I walked up when my turn came. I set my beautiful, beautiful volcano on that table. And quick as a minute, I poured in the orange crystal, stuck in the fuse and lit it, and stepped back. And while the fuse was burning down, my teacher was going, "Ah!" And she runs as hard as she can straight toward the volcano with that ruler. She's going to beat it to death. And then the ammonium dichromate crystals caught. And my volcano was producing sparks, yellow sparks and white sparks that were shooting a foot in the air and hissing and popping, and volumes of grayish, greenish, blackish ash were tumbling down the sides of this volcano like lava. It was beautiful. Well, she went, "Ah!" and ran out of the room. And all the other kids in the room got as far from me as they could get. They went all the way to the back wall. And I stepped back from my volcano and went, well, after a minute, she comes running back in, and she's got one of those old fire extinguishers that's got a silver ring around the top and some brass sides, and the hose comes out of the top, and you flip it over, and it mixes soda and acid, and it comes squirting out the hose. And she attacked my volcano with that fire extinguisher and blew it to pieces. Chunks of soggy paper mache were flying all over the place, and puddles of fire extinguisher fluid were on the floor and on the table with little blobs, little mounds of this dry, blackish, greenish ash floating along. It was fabulous. And then she ordered all the other kids in the room to report to the cafeteria. And she went to her desk and she wrote a note and sealed it in an envelope and handed it to me and said, "Matches." So I turned in my matches, and the note was addressed to Mrs. Pearsall. Well, I got home. I lived about 3 blocks away, and it took me about 2 hours. There was just all sorts of stuff to do on the way. And I got home, and Mom was taking her standard afternoon nap. And so I just went in my room and shut the door. And after a little while, my father came home, and I figured he better see this. He better understand what's going on. After all, this is all his fault. And so I showed him the note, and he read it. He said, well, I'll give you a ride to school tomorrow. And he put it in his shirt pocket and went back to reading his Scientific American. So the next day, Pop gave me a ride to school. And the two of us reported to the principal's office. And I didn't know this at the time, but it turned out that the principal's office had an inner office and an outer office. And the outer office is where you waited to be called into the inner office. And the outer office had some uncomfortable chairs, smaller than little bitty chairs, and a big sign that said, "The principal is your pal." So he and I sit there for a little while, and then the principal comes to the door, and she says, "Mr. Pearsall." And my dad got up, and she looks at me, and she said, "You go to your class." So my dad had to go in the principal's office. I didn't know if I was ever going to see him again. Well, I went to class. It was all cleaned up, and everything was kind of back to normal. My teacher never mentioned my volcano. It didn't come up. And that evening, I went to see my dad. He was sitting there in his chair, and I said, "So how did it go?" And he said, "Okay." And he picked up his Scientific American and went back to reading it. So I went to class the next day and the next day. And it turned out that one thing had changed. My teacher never once smacked another kid on his palm with that ruler. Never once. But that didn't stop me from daydreaming. I was still busy daydreaming, and when I got caught, my punishment was I had to go sit in the corner where there was nothing to look at but two walls with all the kids behind me. It was perfect. It was the ideal thing for a daydreamer. I would get caught daydreaming and sentenced to daydreaming. And I would sit there in the corner and daydream, and sometimes I was Davy Crockett challenging Mike Fink on a raft in the Mississippi River, and sometimes I was Zorro carving a Z into Sergeant Garcia's butt. And sometimes I was Tarzan swinging through the jungle on a liana, and so on. But most often, my favorite daydream was I was an explorer, an intrepid explorer on a lush tropical island, saving a lush tropical maiden from being sacrificed at a volcano that looked exactly like mine. Hi. So I guess I should have told you that both of these stories are new. They're real, they're true, but I've never told them in public before. Nobody who's ever heard that first story and who knew my father or me as a 7-year-old could doubt its veracity. But the story that I'm about to tell has never been believed by anybody I've ever told it to. And yet it is the truth. It is the truth. When I was in college, one of the ways I worked my way through school was as a short order cook. And there was this period where I was working at Shoney's, and I had the night shift. So I'd get there about 4:30, prep for dinner, cook dinner, After dinner, we'd sort of have a slow time until closing time at 10, and then we'd close and we'd do cleanup. And probably sometime around 11 o'clock, we'd clock out and get locked out. Well, I had the hots for a waitress. And she was tall and slim and bleach blonde. And she had a whiskey and cigarettes voice that I found incredibly attractive. And she was 6 or 7 years older than me, and I was sure she could teach me things. And I wanted to go out with her really bad. And every time she would come to the window and yell, "Ticket!" I'd try to catch her eye. And every time I put an order up for her and yelled, "Order up!" I'd wait there at the window until she came by to pick it up, and I just sort of, nothing happened. We just sort of never connected till we did. And one night, in the middle of cleanup, she says, "Hey, chicken, you want to walk me home?" Now, I need to tell you why she called me chicken. When you do cleanup in a restaurant, one of the last things you do is you carry all the garbage out to the dumpster. And that was one of my jobs. And one of the things that always went into the garbage was leftover fried chicken, and I always made sure there was some of that. And I always wrapped the leftover fried chicken in a piece of aluminum foil, and then when I took the garbage out to the dumpster, I'd put the garbage in, and then I put that that aluminum foil wrapped package of fried chicken right on top, just inside the door. So I could come out, after I clock out and lock out, I'm going to go out and get my chicken and take it back to the house full of hippies where I lived. Well, she said, "Hey, chicken, how'd you like to walk me home?" And I said, "Sure." So we clocked out and got locked out. We started walking home, and she's leaning into me. I mean, she's kind of letting her thigh rub up against my thigh every now and then, as if by accident. And then she'd let her shoulder rub up against my shoulder every now and then, as if by accident. And she was making a point, something she was saying, she'd touch me. And we finally got to her house, and we went up the 3 steps to the stoop and walked inside, and she had all this money in her pockets that she had to, it was all her tips. And so she took all this money and she puts it in a big pickle jar on the sideboard, and then she goes and sits on one end of the couch. And I didn't want to be presumptuous, and so I went and sat on the other end of the couch, and then she scooted right down next to me and leaned into me again. And I thought, this is promising. This is looking good. Well, about the time I got my arm around her, I hear a blam, blam, blam on the door. And she says in her whiskey and cigarettes voice, "Sugar, I think you better get that for us." So I stood up and I went over to the door, and there is a big guy. I mean, this was a big guy. He looked like he had retired from a career as a linebacker for the NFL so he could go to work for the FBI. He was big and blocky and square and tapered, and he had a clean, square jaw, looked like Dick Tracy jaw, and jutting forehead. And he looks at me and he says, "Open up." And I looked at Ruth, and Ruth said, "Let him in." So I opened the door, and the big guy came in and he says, "All right, kids, let's party." And Ruth said, "Okay." And I said, okay. And the three of us went out and got in his car. And it was just like him. It was big and cubical and boxy and blocky, and I don't know what kind of big car it was, a Pontiac or an Oldsmobile or a Buick or whatever, but it was a big car. And we got in this thing, he's in the driver's seat, and Ruth is in the middle, and I'm in the passenger seat, and Ruth is kind of leaning into me. And I'm thinking, wonder where this is going. And we drive out Kingston Pike toward Oak Ridge, and we go about 4 or 5 miles, and he pulls into this big parking lot on the left-hand side of the road, and at the back end of this big parking lot is a big one-story red building. And then I knew where we were. This was the notorious Senators Club. And the Senators Club was the only place in Knoxville, Tennessee where you could get a mixed drink or gamble without belonging to a country club. And he obviously was a member because they let us right in. And the front room of this place was like a dance hall. I mean, there's a big dance floor in the middle with wooden floor, and there's tables all around 4 sides. And there's a jukebox in the corner, and jukebox is playing moldy oldies, you know, Tommy this and Tommy that, and you know who I'm talking about. Duke of Earl, Dream Lover, Town Without Pity, and everybody's slow dancing. So Ruth and the big guy and I went and sat at a little table, and we ordered a round of drinks, and Ruth and I both got gin and tonics, and the big guy got a double Jack Daniels on the rocks. And after a few minutes, he vanished. He just sort of got up and went away. And Ruth said, he's going to go play. And I said, okay. So we sat there and tried small talk for a while over our gin and tonics, and then we got up to dance, and it was slow dancing. And it wasn't this kind of slow dancing, and it wasn't this kind of slow dancing, it was this kind of slow dancing. And it was belt buckle polishing dancing. And we did that for a couple of hours. And then a big guy showed up, and he said, I'm busted. I need some more money to win it back. What you got? And Ruth went. And I got my wallet out and opened it, and I had a 20 and 4 ones, and he snatched that 20 quicker than I could, like that, and disappeared again. Well, I thought maybe it'd be okay, because as soon as we got back to Ruth's house, she'd get me some money out of her pickle jar, and then she could get it from him when the time came. So we danced some more, and then they blinked the lights to let us know that the place was closing. And the waitress brought us a tab, and the tab it was just a list of the drinks. It didn't have the prices. And I'm just standing there looking at this stupid tab. 2 gin and tonics, 6 double Jack Daniels on the rocks. And then out sloshed the big guy. And he was just sort of drunk as he could be. And I said, we got to get out of here. I'm busted. And I said, well, we got this tab here. And he said, you pay it. I don't have anything. What? So I got my $4 out, and I laid it on the ticket. And the waitress looked at it, and she said, child, that's not going to cover that ticket. And he says, oh, don't worry about it. Just put the rest on my tab. And I said, what? You got a tab? But I was too slow, and he sort of frog marched me and Ruth out of there. And we got to the car, and he jumps in the passenger side, hands me the keys, and said, drive us home. Ruth gets in the middle, I get in the driver's seat, and start driving us home. It's 2:30. And not a whole lot of competition on the road. Ruth is now not leaning into me. Ruth is stiff as a board, rigid, unhappy. And I don't know what I did. And the big guy is over there muttering obscenities under his breath while he's sort of wavering around and chain smoking. So he and then he sits up and he says, we need to party. And then he punched his thumb on the button of the glove box. And the glove box did not open. So he punched it again and again. And then he kicked it with his knee, and then he slugged it with his fist, and it still wouldn't open. So he reached under the seat and pulled out a small revolver. Now, I saw him do it. I saw him get it out. I saw him point it at the glove box. I didn't believe he would do it, and when it went, blam! I'm weaving all over the road. Ruth is going ballistic. She's screaming and hollering and pounding on him with her fist and slapping him upside the head. The glove box is hanging open. Smoke is pouring out. The car is now full of cigarette smoke and gun smoke. There's an exit wound on the hood about a foot in front of the windshield. He reaches into the glove box, pulls out an 8-track tape, reaches over. Ruth has to spread her legs a little bit so he can get it into the 8-track tape player that's hanging in a bracket under the dashboard. And Tom Jones comes on singing, Lucky Old Son. Lucky old son got nothing to do but roll around heaven all day. I hated Tom Jones. Well, after a little while, Ruth calmed down. After a little while, he sort of calmed down. And after a little while, I sort of calmed down. And I got us to Ruth's house, and I parked the car. And I left the keys in the ignition when I got out because I wanted Big Guy to drive away and let me find out why Ruth was mad at me. But that's not what happened. He reached over and grabbed the keys out of the ignition, got out, pulled Ruth out after him, grabbed her by the arm, and is marching her toward the front door. And she snatches her arm away and she says, I can't believe you did that to my car. And then they go up the 3 steps to the stoop and in the door, and I hear the latch close and the lock close. And it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'm alone on the sidewalk of Knoxville, Tennessee, flat broke, with no sign of money for a week and a half till my next paycheck. And nothing to do but roll on back to the house full of hippies where I lived. So I decided I could at least stop by Shoney's and pick up my chicken. And when I got to the dumpster, I looked inside, and all there were some scraps of aluminum foil. The rats had got that too.